Welcome back. Gosh, wasn't networking so much fun? I really, really love Hop In. Got to meet some really cool people. So thanks for that. I hope you all had fun as well. And now on to the third of four chats today. And as a reminder, this third one being delivered by Trevor is part of a five-part progression that Cody and Trevor and I have a book about. And so if for those of you who are here for all of them, mine was figuring out your revenue formula. What are all the things that you need to do? Cody's was taking all that and saying, okay, what's validated, what's not validated, what do we need to do now and next? And now I'm really excited for Trevor's KPI workshop, which is absolutely amazing and basically helps you figure out, now that I know what I'm doing, how do I know if I'm right or wrong? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Trevor, and I'll see you back in about 40 minutes before our fourth and last session. So take it away, Trevor. Nice haircut.
Hey, thanks, Amos. Yeah, I cleaned up a little. It was quite long. I had some bad COVID here that I fixed, but great to be with all of you. Really excited to dig in to KPIs, to metrics, key performance indicators. I don't know if you're like me, but when I first started wrestling with how to understand metrics in business, I was pretty overwhelmed, and I wasn't a big fan of metrics because they just seemed more confusing than anything else. And I think that's true in some ways. That just startup metrics, metrics in general, are hard, and they're hard because it's super difficult to figure out where and what matters to measure in your business. There's just not one formula or one simple way to solve it. And anybody that tells you there is, they're lying. So what we're going to go through today is a framework. It's more questions than it is answers, but it's a way to think about how to approach metrics in your business. And it's just as much about the numbers as it is about actually goal setting and understanding what the bigger strategy is that you're trying to tackle as a company, and then how does that level up to new things and new opportunities? Awesome. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Go ahead, Aaron. Interrupt me if there's a better way to do this. But I think I can share here in just a second, and I'll have a handful of slides that I'm going to walk you through. And oh, it looks like I might send them over to you. Okay, cool. So I might send them over to Aaron, over to you, to the technical person, to pull them up as we go through. But I'll start with essentially three core questions that I'm gonna have everyone think through, and then I'm gonna give you a few seconds to think about. And we're just gonna take a pause and kind of think through these questions, and I'll throw them in the chat as I pull up my screen for the future. But the big thing here is you can use it for your own company. You can use it if you don't have a venture that you're working on. You can use it for the business that you work for as well, or you can actually use them for your life if you feel like you're just sort of in the stage of you don't exactly know the venture that you're working on. You can think about your own goals in your own life and then answer them through there. So feel free to interrupt me. Last thing I'll say before we jump in, I would love for this to be a conversation. So please feel free to throw in questions in the chat. I would love to hear from you. So feel free to, if you can, feel free to add some comments in the chat, and I think I'll be able to see them. Good. Okay. So the first question that I'm going to put in front that I want you to think about is, as you think about your business right now, what's the single most important thing you have to achieve? So in your business and the idea that you're working on and the company that you work for, or just in your life generally, what's the single most important thing that you have to achieve? And then the second part of that question is, why does that matter? So I'll give you all just about 30 seconds. Think through that question. If you've got a notepad, feel free to write it down or type it into your computer. Okay. All right, and I think I can pull up my screen now, so you'll actually be able to see my my slides if you're able to see these questions. So let me go ahead and pull that up as well. Okay, great. So you should be looking at my at the slides as well. So great. So that's that first question. What's the single most important thing we have to achieve as a business right now? Now, here's the second question I want you to think about. You've got that thing in your head, the single most important thing you have to achieve. What's a number that tells you the status of that thing? What might a number be that would tell you the status of that thing, whether or not what you're trying is working, or if it's or not, if you're getting closer to it or you're getting farther away. I'm cleaning up the slides here so you can see them a little easier. Okay, so take a second. That's your second question. What's the status? What's the number that tells you the status of that most important thing? And then the third is, once we've achieved that most important thing, what will it enable us to achieve next? Give you about 20 seconds to think through that question as well. Okay, the rest of this conversation, the rest of this workshop is basically just going to be me walking through these three questions as we talk about and unpacking them in the context of your companies, in the context of the companies that I've been working with or invested in over the last 5 years. Everything that you could want or want to understand around metrics can be unpacked in these three questions. So with that, let's get started. So question number one, what's the single most important thing we have to achieve as a business right now? Why does that thing matter? Well, if you've been hanging around this track over the last few hours, you've seen a couple of other workshops that we've been through. There's one on that Cody Sims and Maggie Williams did that focused on the idea of priorities and assumptions. How do you understand what matters in the business? There was another one that Amos Schwartzfarb worked off with the idea of revenue formula. How do you break down the business into a mathematical formula that spits out revenue at the end? Well, I'm going to leverage those concepts and those frameworks to help understand and answer this question. How do you figure out what the most important thing is in your business and why it matters? So go with me a little bit here. I'm going to introduce a company to give you an example. MDOS is a network of diagnostic and primary care facilities across Africa. This is an actual company. They went through Techstars Impact, which was based in Austin in 2018. We invested in them, and this is their revenue formula. So if you weren't at the workshop that Amos gave a little while ago, the revenue formula is basically just a mathematical equation of how the business makes money. So you can see, let me kind of make sense of it for you. If you just look at the red bar at the top, think of that as an equation. It's the number of centers. So again, they're a facility or a network of diagnostic centers. So the number of centers that they have times the average visits per center, so the average number of people that show up at a center, times the conversion of those visits, how many people who showed up actually became a patient, times the average price per visit, meaning of those people who showed up and did a visit, how much did they pay on average? So that's the top line revenue formula. And then at the bottom, what you see is actually all of the drivers or all the things that affect those individual variables. So centers are a function of things like location, funding, and staffing. Average visits per center are functions of things like referrals. How do we get visitors to show up? Walk-ins, people who just see us on the street and then walk in, and so on and so forth. And then if you go another layer down even further than that, you'll see the sub-drivers of those things. So these are all essentially the levers. These are the core levers that MDOS can pull in order to create revenue in their business. So this is all a little esoteric, so let me make it a little bit more concrete for you. This is actually the same revenue formula, but with real math. So they have, so for instance, if you have one center that's doing 700 visits in a period of time, let's say it's a month, and 90% of those convert to patients, then and each of them pay around $23 a visit, that's $14,490 in revenue for that week, month, day, whatever the time period would be. Cool? Okay. Make a little bit of sense, hopefully. Good. So what does this have to do with that core question of how do you figure out what the most important thing is? Well, you can start by asking, where within this revenue formula have I hidden assumptions that actually are really critical, but I haven't validated yet, but I don't really understand. So we can find the most critical unvalidated assumption in the revenue formula itself. And really, that's all these numbers are. If you look at the sort of each of these labels, they're really just revealing a critical assumption in the business. And so let me show you what I mean by that. You can reframe or rephrase each of these to something like, for number of centers, is really just a belief statement that you believe you can scale to multiple centers across multiple geographies. And the average visits per center is really just an assumption, a belief statement that you can get people to show up at your clinic. Conversion is really just a belief statement or an assumption that you can serve them in a way that matches their needs, meaning those who show up will actually want to get care or be able to find care that they need. And then finally, the price is just an assumption that you believe you can charge enough to make money. So as you start to look at it like this, then you can start to understand, okay, well, where here are we most nervous, or where do we think the most unvalidated assumption is? And I'll just pick one and give an example that was what MDOS was wrestling with at the time. It was actually visits per center. So they figured out, if we don't get people to show up at our door, if we can't figure out how to do that, none of the rest of this matters. So that's where we're going to focus. And what's cool here is once you begin to answer that question, then you can ask, well, where's the greatest point of leverage? Meaning, where can we most move that number? What are the things we can do to most move that number? For MDOS, it was referrals. They decided if we can we think we can most easily drive referrals to the centers. And if we can do that, then we can increase visits per center and ultimately revenue. And then you can even get more granular and go down with that into marketing. So this is actually where your individual tasks, where your experiments, this is where the kind of day-to-day cadence of your work begins and lives, is inside this all the way down the sort of ladder chain, or the ladder of drivers and sub-drivers. And it's actually, hopefully you can start to see, is that when you think about your business in this way, you can begin to really easily zoom way out and really zoom way in. And you can also, just by taking this revenue formula, putting the numbers in and reformatting it a little bit, build for yourself a default set of key performance indicators. So this is that same data, just reformatted in a way that helps you understand the status of the business. We essentially created a dashboard out of the revenue formula. So we decided the most critical thing to focus on were visits per week. So that's what we put right in the top left corner. And you can see that I've got a big number that says, here's the amount of visitors per week we've had, the visits per week we've had. And then in the parentheses, that's just the percent change. So this gives you the context. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then I rephrased it as the assumption, right? Can we get patients to show up? The things below that are drivers, the different drivers that make up where those visits came from. And then on the right, you have essentially sort of metrics that are kind of helpful to you, supporting metrics that help you watch whether or not the core metric is affecting something else in a crazy way. Cool. I think I'm checking now if there are comments. Feel free to throw them in. I'm not sure. I need to check to see where I'd see them. But feel free to add thoughts and questions. I'd love to hear from people as we go. So that's that first question. How do we understand the most critical thing in the business, and why does that thing matter? Or the biggest thing we have to achieve, I should say. And then why does that thing matter? So let's go to that question again, and let's unpack it. So what's the single most important thing we have to achieve as a business right now? Why does that thing matter? Well, where does that thing live in the revenue formula? And what drivers or sub-drivers does it affect? What will achieving this goal prove about, I'm using some language here, W3, meaning it's just really simple. What does it prove about your customer, who your customer is, what they're buying from you, and why they're buying from you? And then does it help you, what validated high priority assumptions are you acting on when you focus on this thing? And what unvalidated high priority assumptions are you trying to prove by focusing on this one single most important thing? Okay, so that's where the question starts. Understanding what's my goal, where am I trying to go? And then from there, you can move to the second question. Now that we understand where we're trying to head, what's the goal? What number tells us the status of that thing, whether or not what we are trying is working? So this is where we start to get into the kind of nuts and bolts of understanding how numbers work. And numbers are really just language. They're really just another way to tell a story in the business. And so some of those numbers are more effective, or some ways of formatting numbers are more effective than others. So in other words, some numbers are more telling than other numbers. So I'm going to break out a handful of ways to think about metrics. And these are my frameworks. A lot of them are built on other people's work, but it's sort of my way that I made up, sort of understanding how to work with and understand the best ways to format numbers after investing in over 50 companies and working with hundreds more. And I'll go ahead and jump into that. But we'll okay, awesome. I'm seeing some questions come in. So as I jump through this, I'll make sure to cover some of those too. So I see a few questions that I'll just flesh out right now, because I think we're going to be covering some of those as we go. So there's a question here about the best methods and tools for tracking KPIs. I think this is a good question that I'll come back to a little bit. And my short answer, the honest answer, is whatever works. The simplest thing that allows you to have access to it on a regular basis and to regularly consult it and to regularly update it, that's the thing that works. I've seen a ton of companies and often myself have just used Google Sheets. It works great. You can get really fancy. You can use tools like Amplitude. I've seen people do that. People will embed things in a tool called Notion, which is like a sort of whole way of, it's like Google Docs meets like a spreadsheet database with a bunch of other apps connected to it. People have used Airtable. I've used Airtable a lot, but honestly, the simpler the better. And Google Sheets can go a long way. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this next question, actually, that people gave. I'll read it out loud. It's what are some of the KPIs that businesses track but aren't very helpful or very relevant? So this is a great question, and I think a perfect segue to this next part around understanding kind of what I think of as proper metrics hygiene. So there are different kinds of numbers, and they tell different kinds of things. So first of all, you have what's called inputs, and then you have outputs. So inputs are things that you do. So this is the effort that's expended in the business. So it can be things like number of cold calls made per week, number of customer interviews, the number of emails sent. And then on the other hand, there are outputs. There are things that happen as a result of that effort, as a result of the things that you've done. So percent of those cold calls that converted to a demo, or the lessons that you learned, the insights that you got out of those customer interviews, or open rates, click-through rates. These are the sort of the result of the effort versus just measuring effort itself. And generally speaking, the effort is great at measuring what you did. Output is great at measuring what the result of that was. Then there are things like leading and lagging indicators or metrics. So lagging tells you what happened in the past, leading tells you what might be happening in the future. So a churn or percent of churn of your customers, so that means how many customers, the percentage of your customers that you lost, that's a lagging indicator, right? So a bunch of stuff already happened in order to, you can't act on that number, right? It takes you, by the time you found that number out, kind of the pain has happened, the problem has happened, versus something like engagement, which might actually be a leading indicator of churn. So as you see engagement decrease, you might be looking at churn in the future. The same thing around number of sales, that's a lagging indicator, but leading could be something like number of visitors. So you could see leading indicators eventually showing you what's going to happen in those lagging indicators. And an interesting thing to note here is that all leading and lagging indicators are relevant to each other, right? Everything is lagging relative to something else, or leading relative to something else. Cool, okay. And then there are what I call counts, totals, rates, and ratios. So let me break that out. Counts are essentially just a tally of what's happened over time. Pretty simple. Something's like 10 orders, 10,000K in monthly recurring revenue, $25,000 in monthly cash burn, meaning the amount of money you're spending every month. So if you think about a car, which I think can be a really helpful analogy when you're trying to understand metrics, in a car, this would essentially be 150 miles on your trip odometer, or even on your trip odometer. And then what can they do? So these numbers are great at measuring incremental progress, and they keep the team accountable to the work. So you can sort of say, did we do what we said we can do? The second is totals. So totals are accumulation of numbers over time. So some examples could be 10,000 medication reviews on your site, or 10,000 downloads, or $65.77 in your bank account. In the car, these could be 100,000 miles on the car odometer, or a quarter of gas left in the tank. They can give you a sense of, these numbers can give you a sense of scale, of position, of orientation. They can also feed your ego. They're not that helpful in addition to that. And then the third one is rates, which are essentially just a measure of how fast things are happening. So an example would be 10% in weekly growth in daily active users, or 50 miles per hour in the car. So these where things start to get really interesting. This is what helps you see where things might be going into the future. If you can understand the rate, then you can understand what's going to happen into the future. And finally, ratios. And ratios are really about understanding a measure of the relationship of one thing to another. So percentage of listings that are active, or percentage of users that have greater than 3 connections. There was a really famous number that came out of the early days of Facebook, where they figured out if you had a certain number of connections, we could get to you. Somebody should throw into the chat what the number is, because I can't remember it right now. But if it could get you to some sort of number, I think it was like 7 connections, then you were going to be a persistent and really sticky user. You were going to stick around. So that's an example of a ratio that became really effective for that business, and that's what they sort of anchored around. 25 miles per gallon would be a good car analogy, and these are where the insights live. This sort of drives the insights in your business, and they can also serve as a little bit of a health check. Cool. So a couple other questions I want to cover as we keep going here. There's a question about from Daniela. Thank you for it. Around how do you measure quality versus quantity? So that goes back. There's a couple ways to answer that, but to me, one of the main ways that you go back to answer that question is this idea of input versus output. Right? So if you're looking for a quality cold call, for instance, you can measure the output that you want as a result of that cold call. So instead of saying, if say for instance you're managing a sales team and they're doing a bunch of outreach to try to figure out who might be interested in your business, and they're going to do a bunch of LinkedIn, LinkedIn message outreach to see could they get people there. You might be tempted just to say, we're going to measure, are you going to send 50 messages out every week? And then just kind of have that tracking your progress. And that's great if you just want to keep the person accountable to measuring their effort, but you don't really know what that did or why it helped or if it helped the business at all. So it's much better to measure something like, okay, well, conversion to demo or conversion to conversation. So are those LinkedIn messages that you're sending out actually getting you something meaningful for the business? And so that's a way to focus on quality, right? How do you get quality or sort of reach the goal versus just quantity? And I think there's also a question here around qualitative, or could be a question around qualitative versus quantitative data or metrics. And I think that's a really great question too. You can see that you can, I mentioned customer interviews earlier, which is actually a qualitative exercise, but you can put some quantitative dynamics around it just by measuring both the number of interviews that you create or that you host, but also the insights. You can actually measure the number of insights out of it. It's okay, especially if you're in the super early stages of the business. You're going to be spending a lot of time just trying to figure out what the right metrics are. And a good way you do that is by supporting it with purely qualitative stuff. Just quotes from customers or things you saw or things you heard. It's best to focus on the 5 senses, meaning literally things you saw, heard, touched, tasted, or smelled. That's rather than sort of things that are more esoteric. But yeah, qualitative data is still really valuable, especially in the early stages when you're trying to figure out what those metrics are. Good. Okay. So the last thing I'll cover before we keep moving in this sort of sequence is there's a question here around tips for getting people and departments aligned on KPIs if they aren't able to agree. Now, this is like such a good question. And in fact, like I'm going to go back up to this top question here. This is why I start with this question. That's why we start here. What's the single most important thing we have to achieve as a business right now, and why does that thing matter? Because if we can't get alignment on that question as a group, it's pointless to measure or have key metrics, because KPI, right? Key performance indicator. What is it indicating toward? What performance is it indicating if you don't have an understanding of where you're trying to go as a business, the thing it's trying to perform toward? So it's worth spending a lot of time getting clarity and alignment as a team on what we think those KPIs are and ways to tackle that. And then once you have that clarity, then you can begin to get aligned on core KPIs. I don't talk about this too much in this presentation, but these 3 questions that I introduce here, you can actually, once you've had clarity on it as a whole team and you've answered the one question for the one metric for your business, you can do the exact same thing for your teams and your departments. So the next stage in this exercise is let's do this as a whole company, and then let's do it each individually as a team. And we're going to decide what's the most important thing we have to achieve as a team or as a department right now. And why does that thing matter? How does it fit into the overall business goal? How does it support it? And then the more you're able to, once you have clarity on that big goal and the metrics that you're tracking as a business, and the more you're able to drive down the decision-making and the ownership of those metrics, the other metrics to your individual teams and departments, the better. So maybe the second answer to the question here on how to get people aligned on KPIs is once you've had your core KPIs articulated, you let them decide what their KPIs are. So you say, you tell me, what are your key metrics? You understand where the business is going, you understand the revenue formula. You tell me based on how your efforts and your team fits into that revenue formula, what metrics you think matter, and we'll go from there. Okay, so awesome. So let's sum up those metrics that we just talked about into a couple of heuristics or rules of thumb. And the best metrics clearly tell you what's working and what's not, and then help you, this is the most important thing, help you do something about it. Metrics are most importantly, KPIs more than anything else are supposed to be decision-making tools. Do they help you understand what's happening in the business? And then most importantly, what to do about it. So they show you opportunities or dangers that might be arising, meaning they're leading, they're not lagging. They indicate real progress. They're not just the effort you're spending. So they're outputs, not inputs. And then finally, they give you a sense of the model, how each part of the business fits into the whole, their rates and their ratios. They're not just counts and totals. So if you wanted to spend some more time on this, if you wanted to unpack it more, here's a handful of questions that you can be looking at to understand more. So what are the numbers that tell us the status of the thing, whether or not what we're trying is working? So a few other questions to think about. How sensitive is the number that you chose? Meaning, is it leading? And does it reveal potential opportunities or dangers quickly? Or is it going to take some time for you to pick up on that signal? Does the core metric have the right context to be useful? So think about time periods or other kinds of periods. So what do you want to compare it to? Is it per day, per week, per month? Is it this time last year? Is it on a per customer basis or per cohort basis? And then finally, are you measuring effort that reflects just work done or actual outcomes that reflect real progress? So if you're just measuring effort, what are you doing to ensure that that effort is having the intended effect? There's a great question here. We'll switch to the third and final part of this workshop in a second, but I see a question here on how you set reasonable and achievable KPIs while still being ambitious. Yeah, so this is great. And it's actually a good thing to clarify that we're going to get to in a second. It's a good segue to the next section. But KPIs, key performance indicators, aren't in and of themselves reasonable or unreasonable. They're just numbers. They're just things that you're counting. So the goal that you're setting to that KPI. So let me give you an example. So we decide that we're going to count the number of messages. Say we're working on a messaging app, and we want to count the number of messages that a user sends per user per day. So that's the core metric we're tracking, because we think the biggest thing that we have to achieve in the business is we've got to get users really, really active. And if we can get the users on our platform really, really active, then we're going to be able to do all this interesting stuff. So that's the metric we chose. We chose number of messages sent per user per day. That's the KPI. That's not achievable or unachievable. It's not reasonable or unreasonable. It just is a number, right? And we begin to track it. What is it today? It's 10. Okay, well, can we get it to 11? Okay, we got it to 11. Now it's at 5. Well, why did it get to 5? What should we do to get it to 20? The question on sort of reasonable and unreasonable or ambitious or overambitious is when you start to think about the goals or the milestones you're trying to set those numbers to. So where do we want messages per day per user to go? So hold that question as we go into this third piece, and I think it'll make a little more sense. So we've talked about what's the single most important thing we have to achieve as a business. Why does it matter? What's the number that tells us the status of that thing, whether or not it's working? And then finally, once we've achieved that most important thing, what will it enable us to achieve next? So with that, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. Say you're walking along and just on a normal old hike in Austin, Texas, where there's a ton of mountains, obviously, in the distance, and you suddenly see a big one, and you think, wow, I want to go climb that mountain. Well, right now, that would actually be impossible. You couldn't climb that mountain because you're far away from it. So you've got to set yourself another goal, a goal that'll get you to the goal of climbing that mountain, and that goal is to walk to the mountain. So you get walking. Awesome. You're a pretty good hiker, and you know that there are a couple of things that are pretty important if you're going to try to get to that mountain. One, you need to make sure that you're facing it whenever you walk. You've got to stay looking at the mountain, because if you don't look at the mountain, you're not going to go towards it. You try to walk away from it, you're never going to get there. And the second thing is you got to walk fast enough so that you can get there before dark, so that you don't get stuck outside in the dark and then get lost. So those are your things that you have to do to get to your goal. Those are essentially your key performance indicators, your KPIs, your orientation, am I facing the mountain, and how fast am I going? All right. So as you track those KPIs, your speed, your orientation, you're pretty good, and suddenly you get there. Whoa, congratulations, you did it. Proud of you. And guess what? You've just opened up a new goal, a new opportunity. Before you couldn't climb the mountain, now you can climb the mountain because you're there. So you've got a new goal and a new set of KPIs. So this time, a couple of things matter to you that didn't matter to you before. One, the most important one, is anchor points. So now that you're climbing a mountain, you've got to focus on the number of points attached to the mountain. Because if you don't have any, and if you fall, you'll die. You don't want that because you won't be able to get to the top of the mountain. And the other thing is speed upwards. How fast are you going up? Because if you don't go fast enough, again, it'll get dark, and again, you'll get lost, and that would be bad. Good thing, you're a great climber too. You make it to the top. So that goal of walking that got you to the mountain enabled you to get to the goal of getting to the top of the mountain, which you had a different set of KPIs for, which got you there, which in and of itself can open up a new opportunity, like base jumping. So what does this have to do with metrics and goals and understanding what's happening in your business? Well, this is all essentially, everything in your business is essentially one gigantic if this, then that chain. Here's what I mean. If this, then that. And if that, then this. So once you've achieved that most important thing, what will it enable us to achieve next? That's the core question you want to wrestle with or think about for understanding what reasonable or achievable KPIs you want to be able to set. A milestone matters to the degree to which it opens up a completely new opportunity or new world for you, something that you couldn't get to before. So the goal doesn't matter at all if it's reasonable or achievable. It only matters in the sense that it triggers another reality, another world. Does it get you to the mountain? because then you're going to have a new set of KPIs and you're going to be tracking those. Or does it get you to the top of the mountain? Or does it get you somewhere else? Awesome. So if you want to spend more time unpacking this question and the end of this, here's some things to think about. How will you know when you've achieved your most important thing? Again, this is the sort of the goal setting or milestone approach to your KPIs. You've got, let's say, for instance, go back to this messaging, messages per day. Is it 100? You're going to say, because we think that if we can get to 100 messages per user per day, that level of engagement is going to be strong enough that they're going to be already messaging with a bunch of other people, and then we could focus on user growth from there, just as an example. Describe the new reality you'll be in once you've achieved your most important thing. What other metrics will change and how? And then how many steps down this, if this, then that, if that, then blank logic chain have you thought through in your business? And then what metric might you focus on to tell you whether or not you're getting closer to achieving the next most important thing, the thing that's going to happen after this thing. Awesome. So everything, that's it. That's the core part of this workshop. I want to spend a couple of minutes now just talking through once you have your metrics, how do you make use of them as a company? If you have more questions, feel free to jump in. I'd love to answer more of your questions, and I'll actually leave time just for questions here in just a minute or two. But again, now that you have understood your metrics, a big and really critical component is going to be understanding what are the rhythms that you want to use to engage those metrics. So where are they going to live? Where online do they live? Where in an analog version do they live? Do you have a board that you can literally put the numbers on so you're seeing them day in and day out? That company I told you about earlier that we went through, MDOS, the Network of Diagnostic Centers, he literally, Shoga, the CEO, literally has like a KPI room where he just has all of his metrics up on a wall, and he'll just stay there and stare at it for hours at a time, just trying to understand the patterns and relationships in his business. And it gives him insights as a result of that. Where and how are you going to check on them regularly as a team? KPI meetings held as a team at least weekly are critical. So usually I encourage companies that I invest in to do a weekly KPI meeting together. And each of the team members are getting up and saying, here's the metric that we're accountable to. Here's where it went. Here's what we learned and what we tried to do to affect it. And then here's what we want to do next. And then it's important to think through on how you'll set longer deep dives to understand those numbers, probably on a monthly or quarterly basis. Setting out time as a team for a half a day or a few hours to do an offsite to really understand the metrics are going to give you a better high-level overview of what's happening. And then, are there any other metrics you want to be watching on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and why? Okay, I'll stop my screen now and see if there are any more questions that come in. But have really enjoyed spending time and giving you a little bit of a taste of how I think about metrics, how the companies that I've invested in and worked with, both at Techstars and outside of it, have thought about metrics. It's actually a really fun topic if you begin to understand this idea of the metrics themselves are just numbers that are telling you something about the business. It's like secrets. And if you can figure out what those secrets are, then you can unpack all kinds of things in the business. So thank you again. I'll give a second or two to see if any more questions come in. Please ask them if you have it. And then I think I'm finishing up just a little bit early, so I'm sure in a few minutes we'll have an opportunity to do some more networking or go into the next session. So let me give us a couple more seconds to see if there's any more questions. If not, I'll have a few more things I can chat about around how I've thought about metrics. There's a question here around creating KPIs and what's the single biggest challenge. And to me, it's like the hardest thing to do in understanding what KPIs matter or getting clarity on two things. The first is that goal. Do we have a good understanding of the most important thing we're trying to achieve and why? I think sometimes that can be easier or harder. I used to run a company that was a social selling company. It was a way to buy and sell directly over Instagram, and we had some clarity on that. We actually, okay. Well, I'll wrestle with this. Actually, we sort of wrestled with the question relative to that. So we're trying to understand, okay, what's the most important thing we have to achieve right here? Is it getting buyers on the platform, people that are purchasing, or is it sellers? Do we want to get people who are actually selling on the platform, or do we focus on something that's more collective or sort of bigger for both of them? Is it something like transactions? Are we trying to just drive transactions in the business? And each of those can have different effects. What we decided is that we're looking to drive sellers, because if we can get sellers onto the platform, the way that platform works is actually sellers brought along customers themselves. So if we can get sellers on the platform, then they're going to drive buyers onto the platform, and that's going to increase transaction volume as well. So I think it's that question to answer, again, to go back to this question of how do you understand what's the biggest challenge in figuring out KPIs? It's really just figuring out, like, okay, what is our goal? What's going to help us get to that goal? And then once we pick the number, what's the effect of that number? By measuring that number, what is it going to do? What is it going to incentivize in the business? Because it can be different things, and it really is an iterative process. It takes a while. Okay, so if you built out an MVP, here's another question from Jujube. Hopefully pronouncing that right. If you have built out an MVP, what are the metrics that can help most for the startup? I wish I had a simple answer for that, other than to say it very much depends on what the goal is and the critical assumptions you're trying to test in the business. My guess, if I'm going to give you just like something really simple, is it's going to be a metric that measures something around who your customer is, what they are buying from you, and why. So if you can figure out how to measure customer love, meaning like, do your customers love what you're building, what you're doing, that's going to be most likely the single most important thing for you to do in the business in the early stages, because everything else is going to flow from that. So again, it's hard to know just because of it all depends on your goals, but I would say the default answer is go back to figuring out ways to measure customer love. Do they really love your product? That could be the number of times they repeat purchase from you. It could be the engagement they have. And that could be one customer, right? You could have just one person engaging in your app, and all you're trying to do is get that one person to love your product. And they love your product when they are using it a whole bunch, or they talk about it to their friends, or blank. And that blank is what your metric becomes. That's the number you're looking for. And then I think there's one more question here, and we've got about 2 minutes, so I'll wrap this up quick. But assuming you've set aside a part of the company to make sure the first goal stays a cash cow, how many, and who takes the trip to the mountain? Okay, let me see if I can unpack this question. So you want to, how many, and oh man, I wish I don't quite understand the question. But if you're asking something to the effect like, how many trips to the mountain do you go? Like, do you want to keep doing the first goal over and over and over again? That's totally reasonable. You might get to the point where you just say, you just want, your whole goal is just to drive that first thing that you decided to do, and you're just going to keep doing that until you decide you've got a new opportunity that opens up. So totally okay to focus on that unless you see a bigger opportunity to work on. There's no reason to switch your metrics if your metrics are working and it's getting you to where you are. I think we're at time. Super grateful for all of you who spent the time engaging. Really, really thankful. And feel free, and would love to answer more of your questions. I think Amos will be back up, and then you're about to hear from two really, really great founders. So stick around if you have the time. Jason and James are both friends and amazing entrepreneurs. So I look forward to hearing from them.
Hey there, and welcome back. Thank you for all sticking around. This has been super fun. Trevor, that was amazing. As I'm sure I gushed on Trevor prior to his workshop. It really is super valuable and a really simple way to think about KPIs, and in particular when you map them to the revenue formula and to identifying your validated and unvalidated assumptions. Now, what you know what you're doing. How do you know if you're right or wrong? So thanks for that, Trevor. This is the second to last time you'll hear from me today, so hopefully you're not getting bored of me.